Barely a week after the budget presentation, the 2024 budget faces great financing hurdles over its 718 billion shilling deficit. Now, according to economic experts appearing before the Public Debt and Privatization Committee, Parliament and the National Treasury need to find sustainable measures for the debt ceiling, which is currently set at 10 trillion shillings. As Nyakundi Kelvin reports, the government has little room to borrow, with Kenya's debt currently at 9.6 trillion shillings.
On Thursday, Treasury CS Professor Njuguna Ndung'u took to the floor of the House to present his maiden budget, outlining the government's plan to spend 3.6 trillion shillings. In the budget, the CS indicated that government intends to raise 2.9 trillion shillings in revenue, creating a deficit of 718 billion shillings. While questions abound on the feasibility of raising 2.9 trillion shillings in revenue, the real hurdle is in the intended borrowing of funds to seal the 718 billion shilling deficit. Though the government has access to both local and international markets, Parliament set a debt ceiling of 10 trillion shillings. Now, this is where the complication arises. As at the end of May 2023, Kenya's debt stood at 9.6 trillion shillings. This means that the government can only borrow 400 billion shillings before hitting the ceiling. This then raises the question as to how much of the 718 billion shillings the government can borrow, given that it continues to borrow to the end of June this year and had as late as last week raised an additional 213 billion shillings through an infrastructure bond. The math, as they would say, is not mathing.
If the function is to ensure that you manage public debt management, then perhaps Parliament should be having a more intensive discussion on what the deficit numbers should be every year. So placing those arbitrary estimates about whether it's 55% of the gross domestic product in net present value terms or not does not matter. Let me tell you the reason why it doesn't. It doesn't because sometimes in our country, even the numbers related to what the gross domestic product is are disputed.
Treasury has already made a proposition to Parliament to change the calculation of the debt ceiling from a nominal or fixed figure to a percentage of GDP. This proposal is, however, even more problematic, as Treasury wants the ceiling set at 55% of GDP, which at the current GDP of 13 trillion would peg the debt ceiling at 7.35 trillion shillings, which is below both the current debt ceiling of 10 trillion shillings and Kenya's debt of 9.6 trillion, give or take 213 billion borrowed last week.
The definition of 55% as the threshold for debt, in our view, fairly has no meaning at all. And the reason for that is that when Parliament approves, and we understand that it is a function of Parliament according to Chapter 12 of the Constitution, when you approve a budget deficit, you've effectively approved borrowing. So placing an arbitrary cap at 55% in our view has not solved anything.
This leaves both Parliament and Treasury with few options, the riskiest of which is to allow Treasury to incur debt and justify it later on.
Where you sit, what do you think the solution to this problem can be?
Our general comment is this: Parliament must avoid ceding its work to the executive, because then it muddies the division of powers separation of powers and the oversight functions that you're supposed to do.
In the end, there remains no clear way forward, leaving the final decision in the hands of the Public Debt and Privatization Committee. But come 1st July 2023, a new financial year will dawn, and with it, the question as to just how the government will finance its 718 billion shilling budget deficit, with the 10 trillion shilling ceiling squeezing its borrowing capacity. Nyakundi Kelvin, KTN News.
The National Olympic Committee of Kenya to support Malkia strikers' preparations for